Chapter 511. Click. Darkness enveloped my vision as the doors behind me closed shut. Raising my hand, I snapped my fingers. Snap. A small flame formed in front of me, illuminating what was ahead of me. Rather plain. Apart from a small bed that sat in the corner of the room, there was nothing else in the room. Not even a toilet. Shaking my head, I proceeded to lay down on the bed. The bed was rather hard, but I made do. Beggars couldn't be choosers. Beside me, the flame continued illuminating the place. Raising my hand, I glanced at my wrist. They sure are confident. I had originally thought that they would have taken my bracelet away, but that never happened. This surprised me quite a bit, but who was I to complain? This perfectly worked in my favor. Reaching my hand out, I slowly clenched it. I then opened my mouth and asked, "Are you sure Amanda's father is the Overlord?" "Yes." A voice echoed from near the door of the cell. I lowered my hand and frowned. "I have no choice but to become an emperor rank, don't I? If you want to meet him, that's your only choice." "I see." I nodded. Raising my head, I gazed in his direction. There was something I was curious about. Apart from more resources, what's so good about being an Overlord rank? Freedom. He only replied with one word, but that was enough for me to understand everything. Sitting up straight, I asked, "Are you saying that once someone reaches Overlord rank, they will be freed?" "Not quite." My other self shook his head. Turning his head to gaze in the direction of the door, he replied, "For an Overlord to gain freedom, they must first win against one of the ruling dukes." Jesus. I took a cold breath of air. Beat on of the ruling dukes? I assume their strength will also be suppressed. If not, how would anyone be able to win? The other me nodded. It will be, but unlike the challengers, they won't wear any artifacts to suppress their strength. Wasn't this shady? What if they were about to lose? Considering their pride, it wouldn't be strange if they resorted to some petty trick. It's exactly as you think. Confirming my words, the other me leaned his back against the wall. Freedom is merely some false hope given to ignite the fighting spirits of the contenders. They never planned on freeing them from the very beginning. As expected. Letting out a long breath, I sighed. Don't worry too much. Just focus on reaching Emperor rank for now. All other things will come naturally. The source of this indefector, allworld.com. All right. He was right. There was no time for me to dwell on these matters. Right now my priority was to become an Emperor-level contender and get the chance to fight against Amanda's father, Edward Stern. It was the only way I could get in contact with him. Right. In the midst of my thoughts, it was then that I suddenly recalled something. Touching my hair, I plucked a couple of them and stared at them. Confirming that they were indeed white, I looked up at my other self. Why is my hair white? As I had never looked at myself in the mirror in these past few months, it was only recently that I found out that my hair was white. How did that happen? It was then that my question was answered. It's a side effect of you using that power. The answer didn't please me too much. My eyes squinted. Does this mean that I will have permanent white hair? Not that I really cared, but I was already used to my black hair. If push comes to shove, I might as well dye them black. There was no way anyone would notice this. Right? Ugh. I groaned. What a pain. Glancing at me for a brief moment, he answered. It will turn back to normal eventually. My eyes lit up a little. Really? Yeah. Your hair is currently like that because of the trauma your body has suffered from using so much power. There is a reason why people have ranks. Bridging so many of them without a body that is capable of holding such power will inevitably lead to your body suffering damage. That makes sense. Recalling the events of the past, I couldn't agree any more with his words. The strength that I previously held, it was something beyond my realm of comprehension. For my body to hold such power, I couldn't understand how the only issue I suffered was just my change in hair color. Rather, I should be grateful that the only side effect I suffered was my hair becoming white. No? Stop thinking about useless stuff. Get some rest, you will soon be fighting every day for the next few months. Right. Letting out a sigh, I nodded my head and laid back on the bed. Closing my eyes, I slowly dozed off. It's going to be a busy week. Inside of a dark room, a figure sat cross-legged in the middle of the room. A tangible pressure rose in and out of the man's body as each breath he took caused the room to shake. There was this wild aura around him that would make anyone quake in their boots. Whew. Taking another deep breath, the figure slowly opened his eyes, revealing a pair of deep eyes that seemed to have experienced countless things. There was a trace of insanity inside of those eyes, but it wasn't very apparent. It had still not overtaken his sanity. New novel underfinishes are published here. lworld.com. Please wait for me. He softly muttered. His voice was rather weak, but it was filled with resolution. I'm close. I can feel it. Staring at his hands, a strong undulation of mana spread out. Ruthlessness and bloodthirst flashed across the man's eyes as he slowly closed them. I will win no matter what. Bang! With a crashing sound, a figure slammed against the side of the arena, and the crowd erupted into loud cheers. Yes, fuck him. Screw him. Ha ha ha. And that makes it the 12th victory in a row for our new contender, whose overall rank is now in the 30s and has earned the nickname of White Reaper. Seriously. Listening to the demonist's words, I tried my best to keep a straight face. From White Death to White Reaper. What was up with them in the color white? It's going to be over soon anyway. Secretly sighing, I looked at my opponent, who was still passed out on the ground. For the past week or so, I had been fighting every day and finally managed to earn my current rank. Rank 30. I finally did it. I was only a few ranks away from reaching the top 10. The only ranks that enabled someone to fight against the current Emperor-level contender. Only upon reaching the top 10 of a bracket could someone fight against the current Emperor. There was not much known about him. The only thing I knew was that he was someone whose strength was extremely terrifying. It was then that the demoness came to talk to me. White Reaper, who will your next challenger be? Are you going to repeat your previous streaks and challenge the highest contender you can fight? Gazing around the crowd for a brief moment, I slowly nodded my head. That's correct. My next opponent will be a top 10 contender. The moment those words left my mouth, the crowd erupted into loud cheers. The cheers were so loud that I felt the ground shake for a brief moment. I ignored it. After I become top 10, I will quickly fight the Emperor and get everything done with. There was a 20 rank limit on whoever I could challenge. This was purposely set up so that the Emperor-ranked contender wouldn't be challenged by just anyone. For one to fight him, they must first earn the chance to do so. I was no exception to that rule. As expected of the White Reaper. Once again choosing to fight the strongest contender possible. The demoness hyped up the crowd. Stopping a couple of meters away from me, she winked her eye in my direction. I could feel subtle threads of demonic energy making their way in my direction when she did that, but I merely shrugged them off. As if she could seduce me. For a brief moment of time, the demoness showed a surprised look on her face. She seemed to be surprised by the fact that I was unaffected by her charm. Wasn't strange though. I had plenty of time to train myself against such attacks. Donna was my instructor for a while after all. Her charm was far stronger than hers. With an awkward look on her face, the demoness turned to look at the crowd. For those of you that don't know who his next opponent is, let me give you a brief introduction. Her next words were a brief introduction regarding my next opponent. The current top 10 fighter. Updated under lworld.com. Standing at feet in height and with a powerful build like no one had seen before, we have the Skull Crusher. My mouth twitched ever so slightly. They really need to work on their nicknames. I bet he's naked that because he crushes the skull of all opponents he faced. Just like White Reaper, Skull Crusher never once faced defeat. And not only that, but every time he goes against an opponent, his signature move is to kill them by breaking their skull. No kidding. If not for the fact that I didn't want to show my emotions, I would have probably face-palmed right then and there. The crowd became even lovelier at her words. Why wouldn't they? After all, hearing of such a ruthless opponent, what demon wouldn't be excited? The fight will be held tomorrow, and whoever wins the fight finally be eligible to fight against a top 10 contender and gain the chance to fight against the current Emperor of the Duke-ranked bracket. The crowd stirred even more. But it was at that moment that the demoness's face changed. Turning her head to look my way, she softly said, "White Death. Although your achievements have been outstanding, I would like for you to keep something in mind. The top 10 contenders are on a completely different league than the contenders you have previously fought. You won't be able to beat them as easily as the people you've currently fought." Meeting the demoness's eyes, I blinked once and turned around. "Thanks for the warning." I half-heartedly replied. A figure appeared next to me. Staring at the demoness behind me, he smiled. If only she knows you've been holding back till now. Who cares? I replied as I slowly entered the gates in the distance. I'm saving my strength for when I fight against Edward. My feet stopped briefly. And maybe the current emperor. Gazing at the white-haired figure from above, an amused smile appeared on the demon's face. What an amusing human. So far, the human had shown quite the striking performance by beating his opponents with only a couple of moves. His performances were so overwhelming that they reminded him of the past. Of the current overlord. He too came out of nowhere and destroyed every single opponent in just a couple of moves. That said, Your Excellency, excuse my rudeness, but what do you see in that human? Although I can agree that his performances have indeed been quite outstanding, so are the performances of all top 10 rankers. They too showed similar performances in the past. You may be right. The demon calmly nodded his head. I've just been bored recently. Bored? Yes. Taking his eyes away from the arena below, the demon turned around. With a large hood covering his features, the figure's features were hidden. Even then, a terrifying pressure was exerted out of the demon's body, making it hard for the servant to even lift his head. Opening his mouth, his deep voice echoed throughout the platform. With Duke Adramelech leaving to check out the mess at the borders, I found myself becoming quite bored. Pausing for a moment, the servant suddenly felt his body freeze as he dropped to the ground with both knees. The demon's eyes flashed. Maybe it's time we switch the current overlord. Chapter 5:12. Click. Follow me. Coming out of my cell, I followed a demon out. Everything happened out of nowhere. I was just quietly relaxing in my cell, and before I knew it, a demon came to my room and called out for me. I was quite clueless about where I was going, but I decided not to say anything and just followed along. There was no point in asking questions that I would not get an answer to. That and the fact that I already had an idea of what was going on. This might actually be a good chance for me. Glancing toward my left and right as I followed the guard, I realized that the security was fairly lax. There didn't seem to be many demons patrolling the area, and to make matters even stranger was the fact that my main wasn't sealed. It had to be noted that the demon in front of me was ranked lower than me. If I wanted to, I could kill him with a simple slap. Not that I had any plans on doing that, since I had a goal in mind. Finding Amanda's dad. Furthermore, I was sure that the security only looked lax. In reality, it was probably extremely tight. Had this not been the case, many of the prisoners would have long escaped. The steady and calm of our footsteps echoed throughout the corridors. The corridors were pretty badly maintained, as I could see cracks everywhere. Not only that, but they were also quite narrow, forcing me to move sideways sometimes. To make matters worse, lingering in the air was an old and stuffy smell. We're here. Walking for who knows long, we soon stopped in front of a large metallic door. Standing beside the door were a couple of demons. With a simple nod, the demon walked toward the door. To talk. He then proceeded to knock on the door. For the first couple of seconds he was met with no response. However, this did not last for long, as the door soon started to open. Click. Once the door was half opened, I was finally able to catch a glimpse of what was behind it. A luxuriously decorated room that far contrasted the shabby room I was previously staying in. A nice red carpet blanked the floor, and all sorts of decorations appeared in the room. From sofas to paintings and other things that would make one drool at the sight. So this is how the top rankers live. Gazing at the room for a bit, my line of sight paused on a few individuals inside the room. After a quick look, I was able to assess that they were the top rankers of the Duke bracket. It was hard not to notice them. The pressure that their bodies emitted was quite frightening. It was at a level where I needed to take them seriously if I wanted to win. Not that I showed it outwardly, as I kept a straight face and stepped into the room. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt everyone's gazes pause on me, carefully scrutinizing every part of my body. Not bothered by them, I calmly walked toward where the sofas were and leisurely sat down. Crossing my legs and leaning back, I opened my mouth. So, I looked at everyone in the room. What did you guys want to talk about? Silence. No one in the room said a word as they continued to stare in my direction. Visit to lworld.com, discover_new novels. It was then that someone finally spoke up. This human seems to be quite cocky. Standing just at about 4 feet in height with a long ginger beard was a dwarf. Raising his brow, he took a step forward and calmly analyzed my body. Not bad. Extending his hand, he presented himself. I'm Steampunk, rank 5 in the bracket. White Reaper, rank 30 in the bracket. I shook his hand back. As I did, I suddenly smelt a foul odor coming from the dwarf. His breath stinks. Moving my head back, I tried my best to not make any strange faces. His breath was simply atrocious. White Reaper. It was then that a soft voice called out for me. Turning my head, I found an elven lady staring in my direction. She had a rather long scar tracing down her face, and I could feel hints of insanity in her eyes. Her hair was a mixture of gold and silver, and if not for her scar, she would have looked extremely beautiful. I stared straight into her eyes. You are rank 2 Silver Moon, she replied in a disinterested tone. Do you know why we've called you here? Somewhat, I answered. She nodded her head. The other people in the room became even more apprehensive as the room became tense. If you know why we've called you, then what do you think? Will you join our group? I smiled. Group, huh? I had already been briefed by my other self about what this group was all about. It was essentially a group that maintained ranks by fixing matches. The purpose of this was so that they could monopolize all the top 10 spots and support the current emperor rank. In short, everyone here was his lackey. Before I had a chance to respond, she took a step to the side and extended her hand. We've seen your potential, don't let it rot in this place. Only if you join a group like ours can you have the chance to become an overlord-level contender. Her words were filled with conviction and resoluteness. Had I not been warned beforehand, I might have even been tempted by her words. Oh. I gave her a half-hearted reply. The face of the elf changed when she noticed the tone of my reply, and the room became even tenser. You don't seem excited by this. Do you by chance happen to know that once you become an overlord-level contender you can gain freedom? I do. I nodded. Of course I did. This was something that was told to me on the very first day that I was here. All participants were told this. With them having a goal in mind, the games would be a lot more entertaining to watch. If you know, then why do you look so disinterested? Are you perhaps not keen on the idea of freedom, or? Her eyes squinted and a powerful pressure sprung out from her body before heading in my direction. Are you just not interested in joining us? Visit lworld.com for a better reading experience. Because her actions were sudden, I was caught off guard a bit. Even then, I retained a passive and nonchalant look on my face. Glancing around the room and seeing everyone staring at me with bloodthirsty looks, I leaned back on the sofa and calmly asked, "What do you want me to do?" The pressure coming out from Silvermoon instantly disappeared. A smile soon replaced her previous scowl. "Much better," she muttered in a satisfied tone. Clasping her hands together, she cut straight to the chase. "Lose your next game." I leaned my head forward a little. "Lose my next game?" "That's correct." Turning her head, her eyes paused on a certain individual standing not so far from where I was. Turning my head, my eyes paused on a towering figure. He's big. I had already noticed him from the moment that I had entered the room, but now that I took a closer look at him, there was this sense of dread coming out from his body that made one shiver. In contrast to the others in the room, the bloodthirsty aura coming out of his body was far greater. Skull Crusher. I mumbled underneath my breath. I would only have to be a fool to not have been able to recognize him. The aura that was coming out of his body was simply terrifying. Even for me, it was quite pressurizing. It felt as though I was back in Isanor, in the presence of the orc's #1 contender, Chimer. Overhearing my words, the Silvermoon smiled. "It looks like you've recognized him." Walking next to the orc, she patted him on the shoulder. "Rank 10 Skull Crusher. Your next opponent and someone who you will lose to in the next round." "I don't need this." Slapping the elven lady's hand off, Skull Crusher glared in my direction. "I don't need him to purposely lose in our next match. I can easily get rid of a fly like him." "You may be right, but rules are rules." She turned to look in my direction. "I'm telling you for your own good. If you're interested in ever becoming free, then this is your only chance." Raising and lowering her head to scrutinize me carefully, her brows knit for a couple of seconds. She then warned, "You seem quite strong, but like Skull Crusher said, any one of us in the room is enough to crush you. It is in your best interest to join us." After a while, she extended her hand in my direction. Her face was filled with confidence when she said those words. "So what do you say, will you join us?" Staring at her extended branch, I softly muttered. Tempting. The elven lady's smile brightened. That great. Cutting her off, I smirked. The faces of everyone changed the moment I did so. But I did not care. Placing my hand on the sofa, I slowly stood up. Then turning around, I waved my hand and made my way out of the room. The source of this interfactor. Lworld.com. Thank you for your offer, but I will have to refuse. As if I'd join a group of people that I will eventually have to discard in the near future. Following my words, I headed out of the room. Since contestants could only fight each other in the arena, I wasn't worried about them trying anything in the meantime. Exiting the room, I nudged the demon that had brought me with my head. Let's go. Clank. Once the door closed, a heavy silence descended on the room. Apart from the elven lady, none of the faces of the people in the room changed. They didn't seem to particularly care. I see. Silvermoon darkly scanned the room. Turning her attention towards Skullcrusher, she coldly ordered. Make sure you let him know his place tomorrow. Take your time. Make him understand the consequences of his actions. Kara. I would have done this even if you hadn't told me. Skullcrusher replied while clenching and unclenching his fists. A cruel and bloodthirsty smile hung on his lips. Good. Taking a look at the other people in the room, she turned around and headed out of the room. Clank. Closing the door behind her, she turned right and headed deeper down the corridor. Following her from behind was a demon. Walking for the next couple of minutes, she eventually stopped in front of another door. Talk. She knocked once. The metallic echo of her knock reverberated throughout the corridor. A soft and gentle voice followed the knock. Come in. If you will excuse me. Extending her hand, she opened the door. Clank. Upon opening the door, she was presented with a similarly decorated room to the one that she was previously in. However, if there was a difference between the two, it would have to be the fact that there was less furniture in this room. Taking a couple of steps into the room, she soon stopped. It wasn't because she wanted to, but it was because she couldn't. Raising her head, her line of sight fell toward a figure that sat cross-legged in the middle of the room with his bare back facing her. His silver hair descended down his back, and a terrifying pressure bore down on the area next to him. After a brief moment of silence, the figure spoke. How did it go? He rejected the offer. Silvermoon darkly said. Clenching her teeth, she added. He completely dismissed us, treating us as a joke. Is that so? The figure in the middle of the room softly said. For a brief moment of time, the elven lady felt a cold chill run down her spine as she weakly nodded her head. Why, yes. I understand. Lowering his hands, the figure slowly turned around. His eyes soon met Silvermoon's and her body froze all over. A huge sense of dread that she had never felt before washed over her body. Visit to lworld.com, discover_new novels. You know what to do. Why, yes. Chapter 513. This will be a short fight. Overlooking the arena from above, Silvermoon's eyes narrowed. All of the top Duke bracket competitors were standing beside her. That's good for Skullcrusher. Yeah. It was a given considering his strength. Although he's nothing much himself. None seemed to be interested in the upcoming fight. There was an air of certainty about the fight, despite the fact that it hadn't even begun yet. Who was going to win was already clear to them. Why do you even bother with that human anyway? A lazy-looking figure languidly asked. His shoulder-length black hair spread across the sofa as he leaned back against the sofa and stared up at the ceiling with his yellow-colored eyes. From his mouth he took out a popsicle and looked at Silvermoon. I admit that he is strong, but Skullcrusher should be able to handle him. I know. Silvermoon replied. Glancing back at the figure, she asked. You're also a human, what did you think of him? Him. The figure leaned back once again on the sofa and crossed his arms behind his head as he gazed at the ceiling of the room. Whom. He let out a yawn. He ate. Nothing special apart from his hair. That was the last thing he said before he closed his eyes. I see. Silvermoon nodded her head and once again turned to look at the arena below. However, this was merely a pretense. Her attention was secretly drawn to the human from earlier. Rank 3 Lightning Dragon. He was the individual that Silvermoon feared the most out of all the bracket contenders. His strength was quite unknown as he always ended an opponent within a couple of moves. but Silvermoon always felt this unsettling feeling whenever she saw him. She couldn't explain it clearly, but there were times that she would fear him above the current emperor. Perhaps it was because her instincts had been honed over a long period of time, but she knew that the human sitting on the sofa was bad news. Had it not been for his lazy personality, who knows? He could have even been the current emperor. What am I thinking? After shaking her head to clear her mind, Silvermoon returned her attention to the arena. With the demoness already present and preparing to announce something, Silvermoon's eyes narrowed even further. The match is about to start. Her words drew the attention of everyone in the room as they all gazed at the arena. Should we bet on how long the human will last against Skull Crusher? Sounds fun. I want in. In a calm manner, I got up from the bed and walked toward the cell door. Are you ready? Yeah. Nodding, I pressed my hand against the cell door and opened the door. Clank. My ears were pricked up by the sound of several demons waiting on the other side of the door. The most up-to-date NOV_skulls are published under freelworld.com. I didn't pay much attention to them since I was used to such scenes. As he turned around and walked deeper into the tunnel, one of the demons ordered, "Follow me." Without saying anything, I followed him from behind. As for the other demons, they followed me from behind, trapping me completely. This was so that I wouldn't escape. Not that I had any plans to do so. At least not yet. The loud cheers from the crowd inside the arena were the first thing I heard as I neared the arena. The closer I grew to the arena, the louder their cheers became. I suggest you end the fight as soon as possible. A familiar voice reached my ears. Glancing in his direction, I lowered my head and didn't answer. That's the plan. Since I had already antagonized the top 10 rankers in my bracket, there was no need for me to keep formalities. I had to end them quickly to save my energy for when I fought the Emperor. Someone who was most likely going to be extremely hard to fight. We're here. Stopping in front of an enormous gate made out of metal, the demon turned to look at me. Get ready. Your fight will start any minute now. As I lowered my head, I did not respond. I took a deep breath and concentrated on the noise coming from the arena grounds. And in the right corner, with an undefeated streak. Though faint, I could also hear the announcer's voice coming from the other side of the gates. It was the same voice I had been hearing over and over again for the past week or so. Please welcome White Reaper. Clank. With a low rumble, the doors soon started to open. Stepping forward, I entered the arena with my head raised. White Reaper. Fuck him up. Skull Crusher. Destroy him. From the moment I stepped into the arena, I could hear the loud cheers of the spectators. They were filled with energy and bloodthirstiness. I paid them no mind. That was because my current focus was directed toward the towering figure standing opposite of me. We meet again. A large smile spread across Skull Crusher's face as he cracked his knuckles. Prick, prick, prick. Staring back at him, I didn't reply. Don't blame me for what will happen next. We clearly gave you a way out. I hope you last long enough for me to enjoy myself. Sure. I lazily replied. The look on Skull Crusher's face changed when he realized I wasn't taking him seriously, but I didn't notice as I had my eyes on something else. Appearing right behind Skull Crusher was my other self. Due to the fact that no one could see him, his appearance did not attract any attention. Are you going to proceed as we planned? Meeting my gaze, he asked in a soft tone. In the midst of the loud cheers, I could clearly hear his voice. I slowly nodded my head in his direction. Yes. Are the two contestants ready? Just as I nodded, I felt the demoness gaze pause on me. I glanced back at her and replied briefly. Yes. Skull Crusher. Yes. He also gave her a short reply. With a simple nod, she raised her hand and the noise in the arena ceased. A slight smile hung on the demoness' face as she noticed this. The arena grounds became tense as she held her hand in the air. At the exact moment the tension reached its climax, she finally lowered her hand. You may fight. After lowering her hand, she announced the start of the fight and I quickly activated one of my skills. The One. As soon as I activated the One, everything came to a halt. Neither Skull Crusher nor Demoness dared move an inch. At the same time, my other self slowly moved behind Skull Crusher. With my eyes still locked on Skull Crusher, I remained standing. From the corner of my eyes, I kept my focus on my other self. Slowly he positioned himself behind Skull Crusher and extended his leg. It was only then that I took a step forward. Talk. What's going on? Looking into those dull gray eyes, Skull Crusher felt his muscles loosen as he couldn't muster any strength in them. He was paralyzed on the spot. Suddenly his body started shaking. Lowering his head to glance at his hands, he muttered in a trembling tone. Is this fear? This was an emotion that he had not felt for quite a long time. Actually, not quite. He had recently felt this emotion not too long ago. Back when he met the current emperor of the Duke bracket. After having beaten so many contenders without losing a single match, he had grown ignorant and had challenged the current emperor. That was the biggest mistake of his life. Had it not been for his mercy, he would have long died. Impossible. But compared to the sense of dread he felt from the current emperor, the one coming from the small figure standing opposite him was even more fearsome. He couldn't stop his legs from trembling. Is he even stronger than the emperor? Impossible. The dull gray gazes stared back at him once more as he raised his head. Ah. He let out a strange sound. What are you doing? Do something. Fight. Kill him. I will kill you. In the midst of his struggle to find any energy to move, insults were hurled his way. You fat orc. Are you scared? You useless pig. The most up-to-date NO are published under here, allworld.com. Pi bet. It was then that the figure opposite him took a step forward. A calm and audible step reverberated throughout the arena. Because the demons in the stand were so far away from the arena, none of them could feel what Skull Crusher felt the moment he took a step. That single step, although normal, carried a tremendous amount of pressure that almost caused his knees to buckle on the spot. What's this? He shouted in an aggrieved tone. What is happening to me? How could he be scared of someone that was half the size he was? Preposterous. Mustering every little bit of strength and willpower in his body, he slapped his face. Slap. When Skull Crusher slapped his face, a loud slapping noise echoed throughout the entire arena. All forms of noise in the arena ceased as all the demons stared at Skull Crusher with confused looks on their faces. What just happened? Everyone wondered at the same time. Snapping them out of it was Skull Crusher's loud voice. I don't know what sort of trickery you used to cause me to feel the way that I did before, but I won't fall for it again. His body erupted in a terrifying hue of green. Glaring in White Reaper's direction, the muscles of his body doubled in size as his aura started to cover the whole arena. He was going all out from the get-go. Yeah. Fuck him up. So he was using a trick. I knew something was up. Skull Crusher's sudden actions reinvigorated the crowd as they stood up from their seats and cheered even more loudly. Lowering his head, the human smirked. It's useless. Taking another step forward, the dull color in his eyes darkened ever so slightly and the pressure Skull Crusher felt intensified immensely. His body felt as if it was being burdened by a huge mountain before, but now it felt as if several mountains were pressing on him simultaneously. He couldn't move. Yuka. Holding on to his breath, Skull Crusher's face started to bleach as he struggled to lift a finger. What's this? He muttered in an incredulous tone. The calm sound of a footstep once again rang throughout the whole arena. Out of pure instinct, Skull Crusher took a step back. It was then that it happened. Right as he took a step back, he suddenly felt something hard and his vision lowered. Thump. With a soft thump, he found himself on the ground. The noise coming from the crowd once again stopped. Confused, he looked around him. It was then that he noticed it. As he sat on the ground, every spectator in the stand was watching him intently. He felt thousands upon thousands of eyes looking down on him from above. There was a clear judgmental look on their faces as their eyes were filled with ridicule and disgust. What they? A sudden dimming of his vision prevented him from finishing his sentence as a hand grasped his face. Sleep tightly. Those were the last words he heard before his consciousness slipped. Chapter 5:14. On one of the upper platforms overlooking the matches, a heavy, somber atmosphere prevailed. Silver Moon stared at Skull Crusher, who was passed out on the ground without saying a word. She was not aware of Skull Crusher's current condition and quite frankly she didn't care. He had lost and that was all that mattered to her. Regardless of whether he had died or not, she was no longer interested in it. Trash. She uttered in disgust. The match itself had already ruined her mood. As a result, she decided to leave the room as she no longer felt the need to stay there. Before leaving the room, she took one last glance at the arena below before murmuring, "Petty tricks." Click. The door closed shut and she disappeared. As for the other top rankers in the room, they had mixed reactions. While their reactions to the white-haired figure below were not as strong as Silvermoon's, they were still startled by what they had seen. Their eyes were now mixed with fear and apprehension. For him to have beaten Skullcrusher so easily, they themselves couldn't do it. It now became clear to them that whoever this newbie was, he was above their level. Well, almost everyone. Has the fight ended? A lazy and groggy voice echoed out on the platform. Blinking a couple of times, Lightning Dragon lifted his head to view the arena below. The loud cheers had woken him up from his nap. Whom? Yawning out loud, he lazily asked. Who won? Your fellow human member. A deep voice answered his question. The voice belonged to an orc and he was currently ranked 4th in the rankings. Compared to Skullcrusher, he was shorter, but despite his height, he emitted an even more powerful aura compared to Skullcrusher. Human. Taking a closer look at the action below, Lightning Dragon squinted his eyes. His gaze lingered on the white-haired figure in the midst of the arena grounds for a little over a couple of seconds. He looks familiar. He muttered in a loud voice. Upon hearing his words, everyone turned to look at one another. In the past, his words would have seemed odd to them, but now that they were used to him, they didn't think too much of it. To them was someone that had a terrible memory. Sort of. His lack of memory was more indicative of a lack of care. His memory of everyone else present in the room was limited to the current emperor and no one else. The only people he remembered were those who were worth remembering, and it was clear to them that they weren't worth remembering. The same could be said for the white-haired figure below, as Lightning Dragon still seemed to be unable to remember him. Yes, he's won. The orc from before replied. His eyes flickered coldly as he looked at the human on the sofa. However, he didn't dare to move. Try the lworld.com platform for the most advanced reading experience. In his mind, there was no doubt that the human in front of him was frightening, and that he stood no chance against him. Even then, his attitude irritated him to no end. For someone as prideful as him to be treated as nothing but air. The air rang with a cracking sound as he clenched his fist tightly. Whom? Taking a moment to cover his mouth with his hand, Lightning Dragon leaned back against the sofa, completely unaware of the orc's thoughts. That's good for him. He then reached out for a long blue sheath in which a sword rested inside and grasped it with his left hand. Pulling it closer to his body, he closed his eyes. So tired. Smacking his lips, he weakly muttered. Don't wake me up until the Emperor match starts. As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately fell asleep. The room quieted down. Come in. Upon entering a room that looked familiar, Silvermoon lowered her head. In secret, she glanced toward the center of the room where a shirtless man with long silver hair stood. The current Emperor Silverstar. The person that stood at the peak of the Duke bracket and someone whom she served. Taking a closer look at him to make sure that everything was all right, only then did she finally lower her head. Are you ready for your upcoming match? She asked. In spite of the fact that her voice sounded normal, it was tinged with anger. This was naturally picked up by the figure standing in the middle of the room. Is there something up with you? He asked in a rather soft tone. Lifting her head, Silvermoon's tightly furrowed brows relaxed a little. She eventually sighed. It's nothing big. Remember the human that rejected our offer. What about him? He beat Skullcrusher. And it wasn't just a simple victory, but he completely won without even lifting a finger. Her teeth clenched as she thought back to the fight. How dare you challenge our authority? Without lifting a finger? Surprise flashed across Silverstar's face. But it came as fast as it left. Glancing at Silvermoon, he slowly walked up to her. The calm and steady sound of his footsteps echoed throughout the room. Taking a moment to caress her cheek, he halted his steps in front of her. His thumb traced down the long scar that traced down her face, resulting in a faint blush to appear on her cheeks. The source of this indicator. lworld.com. As he watched this, he smiled faintly. It doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? He's directly challenging your authority. Silvermoon protested, but the Emperor shook his head. You know very well that my next match is against the Emperor of the King bracket, right? Yes, I know. Silvermoon nodded her head. This realization sent her heart racing. Just a few minutes from now, the current Emperor Sylvestar would go against the King Bracket Emperor Deathbringer. Who would face off against the Overlord would be decided in this match. Once he was able to beat him, he would finally be able to fight against the current Overlord. The only obstacle stopping him from reaching freedom. Ignore the human for now. Sylvestar took his hand away from her cheek. Her face was filled with reluctance when he did so, but she kept her tone calm. I understand. But are you really going to let him go like that? No. He replied. Before he continued, his attention turned toward an ornate wooden closet not so far from where he was, where a white shirt was hanging. Walking up to it, he took the shirt out and put it on. There are many things that I have to attend to at the moment. So what if he managed to beat Skullcrusher? I can do that too. My real worry is the other human. You mean Lightning Dragon? Yes. Buttoning the top part of his shirt, his eyes flashed coldly. As for that human, I will see how he will be able to run rampant like that once I become the Overlord. Will you really be all right? Silvermoon asked. Worry returned to her voice. Turning around, Sylvestar smirked. You don't have to worry about me winning. That's a guarantee. I am absolute. I'm curious about something. As I returned to my cell, I glanced at my other self and our eyes met. The look on his face suggested that he already knew what I was going to ask. Regardless, I still asked. For how long can you have a tangible form? It had occurred to me a while ago, but sometimes my other self could manifest physically. Having always thought he was some sort of vision, I was somewhat surprised by this revelation. I was quick to adjust though. Coming to terms with this fact, I decided to just accept it and use it to my advantage. Just like what had currently just happened. About 10 minutes. My other self replied to my question. Looking back at him, I nodded. I see. After closing my eyes and contemplating for a while, I had a sudden thought. Opening my eyes again, I asked. The most up-to-date NO-Venderfels are published under lworld.com. How far can you be from me? Not much. Around. About 5 meters. I see. This could serve as good information for me. Definitely plan to keep this in mind. What? Enough about that, what are you planning to do next? In the middle of asking another question, my other self cut me off. Opening my mouth, I eventually shook my head. It isn't worth it. I'm going to challenge the Emperor. I eventually replied. The only thing standing in my way in order to get to Amanda's father, the current Overlord, was the Emperor. The faster I got rid of him, the better things were for me. Although I know he'll be a tough opponent, I haven't gone all out myself yet. You think so? I tilted my head while sitting up straight on my bed. That look. He definitely knows something. My eyes proceeded to squint tightly. You definitely know something. Spit it out. Tell me what I need to know. Heh. My other self smiled slightly. He murmured as he glanced at the door of the room. The current Emperor should be the least of your worries. What are you talking about? I stood up from the bed. I could tell that he was about to say something important. And I wasn't wrong. As he turned his head, he casually said, Lightning Dragon. He is someone who might even be stronger than the current you in the bracket. If you have to worry about anyone, it would be him. What? Utmost seriousness flashed across my face as I stared at my other self. Might be even stronger than me? Although I never once thought that there weren't people stronger than me, it still came as a surprise for me to find someone this strong in the Duke rank bracket. Taking a deep breath, I was able to calm myself down rather quickly. Why are you telling me this now? This was the first time that he had mentioned him ever since I had arrived here. For what reason did he only tell me this piece of news now? The reason is simple. Slowly, he turned his head to glance my way. It's because he is the key to helping you get out of this place. Chapter 5:15. While everyone focused on the empty grounds below, the crowd cheered raucously throughout the arena. Everyone's attention was focused on a certain demoness as she stood in the middle of the arena with a bright smile on her face. Opening her mouth, she emitted a sweet, seductive voice that filled the arena. For today's match on our left side we have Deathbringer, the current Emperor of the King bracket. As she spoke, the gate on the left side opened, and a demon appeared from the other side of the arena. Seeing bat wings splayed across his back in a frame so enormous that it even put some orcs to shame, the crowd became even more enthralled. Kill. Destroy that elf. You better make me something, you traitor. As he stopped in the middle of the arena, he did not bother to look at the crowd. Despite being a demon, he had no sense of attachment toward them. Rather, he despised them with all his being. As he lowered his head to examine his right hand, his eyes lingered on a small black bracelet. Suppressor. It was an artifact created by demons that suppressed the wearer's rank. He had no choice but to wear it since the fight was between two emperor ranks of different brackets. The more he stared at the bracelet, the bigger the scowl on his face became. How fucking dare they? Flap. He flapped his wings once, casting a huge shadow on the ground. An evident display of might by him. In response to his readiness, the demoness reached across the arena with her right hand. There was an air of excitement in the crowd as her sweet voice swept through the air. And on our right side we have Silverstar, the current emperor of the Duke bracket and the challenger. Slowly the gates on the right began to rise. Unlike Deathbringer, Silverstar was met with a lot of hostility. Die, you 11 scum. I can't wait for you to die. You better die, I bet a lot of money on you. This was to be expected. Given their pride, the demons would still rather support someone from their own race over someone from another race, regardless of whether that person was a prisoner of war or had committed a hideous crime like ingesting another demon's core. As Silverstar walked slowly toward the center of the arena, he ignored the noise from the crowd. At this moment, the only thing that was in his mind was his opponent, Deathbringer. As soon as he was a few meters away from Deathbringer, his feet stopped. As he stood at the opposite end of Deathbringer, everyone could see their differences in size. It felt as though an ant was fighting up against a large monster. Their difference was incomparable. While those who bet on Silverstar regretted their decision, those who bet on Deathbringer secretly rejoiced. The difference in size was enough for most people to feel more secure about their choices. Are you two ready? In that moment, the voice of the demoness was heard. The arena grounds instantly became intense as everyone stopped speaking for a moment. Yes. Yes. The two contestants answered at the same time. A satisfied smile spread across the demoness' face as she raised her hand and lowered it. New novel underfinises are published here. lworld.com. You may begin. In the aftermath of her words, the crowd became even more heated and shouted even louder. Yes. Fight. 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 Crack. Crack. As the two figures scrutinized one another closely, cracks began to appear beneath their feet. Both figures soon disappeared from their spot. Boom. As the two figures disappeared and reappeared in front of each other, an explosive sound echoed throughout the arena. Their figures soon reappeared in the middle of the arena, and everyone was able to catch a glimpse of them. As he sought Silverstar, the demon extended his arm in a clawed movement, directly aiming for his head. His attack was fast and fearsome, leaving little time for Silverstar to react. Even then, Silverstar was not an emperor for nothing. Raising his hand, his wand pointed at the claw, and several magic circles formed at the tips of each nail, stopping them in place. Well, at least for a couple of seconds, as cracks soon started to form on the magic circles. Prick, prick, prick. Despite being able to deflect the attack, the circle's power was not sufficient to stop the claw from reaching Silverstar's head, as they broke apart and continued to head for Silverstar's head. Deathbringer, however, had lost most of the momentum by the time this had happened, so Silverstar only had to tilt his head to dodge the attack. And that was exactly what he did. Swoosh. Avoiding the attack, Silverstar pushed his body back as a breeze blew and his hair scattered. With a simple wave of his hand, his hair tied back together behind his back. Raising his wand, he aimed it at the demon. A large magic circle formed at the tip of the staff. With an elegant tap of his staff, he muttered, "Here." His voice led to the magic circle transforming into a blue transparent energy beam that headed toward Deathbringer. Staring at the incoming attack, Deathbringer snorted. Humph. Fully expanding his wing, a majestic black hue began to form out his body. The entire arena started to tremble. His hand was then squeezed into a fist, and the beam headed toward him was directly dispersed in the air, much to the audience's surprise. Dealing with Silverstar's attack, he quickly followed up with his own attack. Raising his hand that was clenched into a fist, he squeezed his back muscles and proceeded to throw a casual punch in Silverstar's direction. Well, that was at least how it looked to the crowd. The opposite could be said for Silverstar, who stared at it with an incredibly solemn look. The punch that Deathbringer threw was anything but casual, and only Sylvestar could sense the strength underlying it. With his hand raised, 3 magic circles materialized next to him, forming a large shield around him. The punch soon came into contact with the attack. Bang! With an enormous explosive sound, the shield started to ripple as Sylvestar's gaze turned firm. Cracks slowly started to form on the outer shield. Trying to supplement the depleting mana of the shield with his own mana, Sylvestar furrowed his brows tightly. Even then the cracks continued to form on the shield. It wasn't long before a glass-shattering sound echoed out, and the first shield broke into pieces. Cage. With a weak groan, Sylvestar took a step back and blood started to seep down his nose. Gritting his teeth, he continued to persevere. Crash. The second barrier collapsed, causing Sylvestar's face to pale significantly. But it was enough as a smile soon formed on his lips. That was because after the second barrier collapsed, the attack finally ceased, leaving behind one last barrier. As Sylvestar glanced at Deathbringer, he could hear the spectators' loud chants. When Sylvestar turned his head to look at the crowd, he could feel their malice-filled eyes and words wishing him nothing but death. He was honestly sick of it. This useless game where he had to fight other people for the sake of the demon's entertainment had become too much for him to stomach. It took all his willpower to keep a straight face. Just the thought made him clench his teeth tightly. However, his anger disappeared as fast as it appeared. Taking a deep breath, he calmed down. Raising his head, he glanced toward one of the platforms. After a while, a soft smile appeared on his lips. I should start now. He raised the tip of his wand and a magic circle formed in front of him. In the meantime, Deathbringer had already rushed in his direction and was only a couple of meters away from him. It was then that something happened. The demonic energy that was emanating from Deathbringer's body suddenly halted, and a horrified look appeared on his face as he clenched his left hand. This happened so fast that no one was able to notice it. But it was enough time for Sylvestar, who slowly smirked. Goodbye, he muttered before Deathbringer's figure was enveloped by his spell. All the demons in the stand stopped moving and looked at one another as a bright wave of energy shot across the arena. A moment after Sylvestar released the spell, Lightning Dragon snapped his eyes open. His attention quickly turned toward the arena grounds below and he paused to observe Deathbringer. More specifically, the bracelet that was resting in his hand. As his eyes lingered on the bracelet that rested on Deathbringer, his eyes flashed in a certain hue before they returned to their regular yellow color. I see, he muttered as he turned his head to gaze in a certain direction. To be more precise, toward a specific platform in the distance. His languid and lazy eyes sharpened for a brief moment. Turning his attention back toward the arena, Lightning Dragon saw Sylvestar standing in the middle of the arena with a cold look. On the ground opposite him was a simple bracelet, nothing else. It was clear that in that short moment he had turned to look away, the battle had ended. After a brief moment of silence, one by one the demons started to protest as they all found the situation ridiculous. Waha! What is this bullshit? He cheated. I will kill you. They weren't angered by Sylvestar's performance, but rather at how easily he had beaten the Emperor rank contender of the King bracket. What kind of sick joke was this? For him to completely obliterate Deathbringer, the current Emperor rank of the King bracket, not everyone could accept such a result. Lightning Dragon took a few minutes to contemplate the chaos before shrugging his shoulders. Meh. Picking up the sword, he sat back on the sofa and closed his eyes. But just as he was about to sleep, he raised his head and glanced at a familiar figure, one that he couldn't quite remember the name of. He only remembered the name of people whose names were worth remembering. This character trait wasn't something that he did on purpose, but it was just the side effect of his martial art. Hey! Opening his mouth, his words instantly attracted everyone's attention. Sensing his gaze pausing on her, Silvermoon stoically replied. But secretly she was smirking to herself. Are you finally going to submit to us after seeing such a performance? What is it? Remind me again. Lowering his head to glance toward the arena, his eyes paused on the figure standing in the middle. Scratching his head, he furrowed his brows tightly. Who is he? Overlooking the arena from above, Duke Anazek's lips twisted in a savage smile. What a wonderful performance. I'm glad it was to your liking. Standing behind him was the same servant from before. His name was Carrick and he was a Mark-ranked demon. For the past few decades he had been serving Duke Anazek as his right-hand man. Everything that happened below was part of his arrangement. Seeing the satisfied look on the Duke's face, Marquis Carrick felt satisfied. Raising his head he hesitated. "Your Excellency, regarding the Overlord match. Proceed as we've arrangement." Seemingly being able to read his thoughts, the Duke ordered. Marquis Carrick lowered his head. "As you wish, Your Majesty. We will do as you have instructed." Taking a bow, his figure disappeared from the spot, leaving the Duke by himself. As he glanced at the arena below, the Duke's eyes remained fixed on Sylvestar. A figure popped into his mind and he smiled. "Time sure flies fast when you're surrounded by such fun." He then licked his lips. "Sadly, all fun must come to an end eventually. It's about time we switched the current overlord."